The Learning Hack is supported by a New Spring, the platform that puts the learner first, shaping journeys that help individuals learn faster and perform better. Access intelligent technology, profound insights, and a unique network of like-minded pioneers. And if you're a trainer or training provider looking to succeed in this fast-changing market, their free ebook will show you how putting the learner first is the key to winning. Download it now at anewspring.com/learnerfirst. That's anewspring.com/learnerfirst.
Yar, 'tis a fine pleasure for me to welcome aboard this here podcast Lauren Waldman on International Talk Like a Pirate Day. She's a learning consultant, she's a neuroscience brain box, and she's a body pirate queen. Yar!
Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what?
Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool. I'm learning. Learning is fun.
Knowledge is power. Knowledge. Education.
Last time on The Hack, we had an L&D detective. This time it's a learning pirate. What is it with these colourful personas? Obviously we love them at The Learning Hack because they provide an excuse for dress up. But what do they tell us about the business of learning? Is it a need to break free of the rather staid, formulaic narratives that dominate organisational life? In the case of Lauren Waldman, who styles herself as the learning pirate, it seems to summon up a rather freebooting, anarchic image that some might feel is slightly at odds with her serious chops as an advocate of neuroscience, not to mention her crusades against the dissemination of learning myths which have a distinctly moral edge. Kate Fitzgerald, Head of Fact, tell us more about Lauren.
Hack Facts.
Lauren Waldman is a learning consultant, educator, and the founder of The Learning Pirate. She works with organisations to create bespoke, scientifically designed learning programs using the latest cognitive and behavioural science. She is a certified training and development professional and has received qualifications in neuroscience from Harvard and Johns Hopkins University and in medical neuroscience from Duke. She is also an advisory board member of the National Communication Coaching Association of Canada.
There's been a recent spate of books about pirates and pirate queens that portray piracy in terms of diverse communities with surprisingly egalitarian working practices where women could take leadership roles. These books include not only works of popular storytelling, but also serious stuff such as Pirate Enlightenment, David Graeber's posthumously published study centred on land-based pirate communities in Madagascar, so maybe the pirate theme is not entirely jokey. I quizzed Lauren about the pirate code, but the bulk of our discussion was really about how she brings the influence of neuroscience to bear on her practice. Neuroscience made vast leaps in the first 2 decades of this century, making it something of a new science. But for that reason I wanted to know, does it sometimes come into conflict with the learning theory of past ages? Lauren Waldman, yar.
Yar.
Did I use the right form of piratical address there? You might have to school me on it.
Yeah, no, you most certainly did. You are really ready, as the YAR stands for.
So you're ready, yeah. Well, it's great to have you on the podcast and welcome aboard the good ship Hack.
Oh, thank you. Dear Captain John.
Yes, salute and all that. Yep. So you bill yourself as the learning pirate, and there's something I've always wanted to ask you. The pirate code, is it a list of rules you have to follow to have L&D success, or is it more a set of guidelines?
Oh, well, any good pirate will tell you it's a set of guidelines.
Yeah.
Although the pirate code and the original pirate rules were pretty strict, but I'd say for the purposes of L&D success, I think we're acting as more guidelines right now. And I certainly have a few that I adhere by in my world of learning and science.
Yeah, so we can get into that in a bit. But I mean, first of all, we ought to be slightly serious. The main focus of your work is neuroscience and learning.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see those two different knowledge fields, I suppose, operating together in practice? So as a learning, I mean, not learning professionals wouldn't necessarily have known that much about neuroscience. And it's made huge strides in the last couple of decades. And now maybe they feel they do. I think you probably certainly do feel that they should know about it. So what skills do learning professionals need to acquire, skills and knowledge, or increase, if they've got some already, in order to work effectively in this day and age, do you think?
I think it's the same question that I had to ask myself when I dove into the sciences. And it was, first of all, how did I not know any of this as a learning professional? If I have to even question what is the process of learning, then maybe I should look into that a little bit more. And then where does that process happen? Yes, we are externally taking in stimuli from our environments, but internally it's our brain that is encoding a memory, which is helping us to, then retrieve that memory to transfer into a skill, behavior, and ability. So when we talk about the importance and sort of the criticality of neuroscience coming into our field, it's within that understanding of, well, what is the thing doing the learning doing? And maybe I should know a little bit about that. And I think in the state that we are in right now, and in this day and age, for anyone in learning to not understand at a fundamental level how even themselves as a human operates a little bit better. And then how do we transfer that knowledge into not only learning better, because we all know how to learn. We would all be dead if we didn't. we are designed to learn. But then how do we take this knowledge of how my brain is operating to what I call join forces with it in order to be a more efficient and strategic learner? If we're designers, then how do we design more effective learning that is optimized for the way that our brains function? And then just on a general organizational and human level, how do I understand myself better to understand other humans better in any environment?
Okay. And is the key to that memory and retaining information, or is there more to it that neuroscience can tell us?
Oh, there's a significant amount more. Memory is obviously incredibly critical. For me to go into any classroom, if I'm working with the academics and the students, or if I go into any organizations and ask anybody, can you tell me how does your brain form a memory for everything that you're supposed to be learning? And for most to not be able to answer that, which is okay. Not everyone studies the brain in neuroscience, but at a very foundational level, it is something that we do need to know, but it's only the scratch of the surface.
So to what level do you think L&D people particularly should immerse themselves in neuroscience? Do you think they should all go off and get PhDs in neuroscience, or you think a kind of BA degree will do it, or maybe just a couple of courses? How much they really need to know?
I definitely discourage my colleagues to go as far down the rabbit hole as I have. It's a very deep hole, and they don't need to go too far down. I think where we have a gap between science itself and the sort of organizational world is, how do we practice? And that's a gap that the scientists face, right? They're in the labs, they're doing the research. Their professional careers are spent helping us to get this knowledge, but then the knowledge has to be translated into a practical application that we can all use and learn. So when it comes to us as L&D people, it's a very foundational level of knowledge. So whereas I understand now very deeply, mechanisms of the brain, neurochemistry of the brain, what's being activated, what's working with what. When it comes to our applying that to the field of L&D, it's more like, okay, can we learn at a very foundational level? How does the brain create a memory? What kind of memories are there? When we are looking at facilitating a conversation, when we're looking at designing learning, focus and attention are absolutely critical to helping the person to use the resources that they've got in their brain in order to learn. So how do we activate those? And those are some, very surface level things that we can all learn very quickly, and then we can transfer into the work and the interactions that we have on a daily basis.
So is there a danger? you say a foundational level of knowledge, but is there this danger that, a little learning is a dangerous thing? You do hear some people they start to throw around terms like, I don't know, endorphins and cortisol and synapses and mycelium sheaths and things. And very often you get the impression they picked up a few terms, but there seems to be a lack of nuance in what they're saying. Is that a big danger, do you think?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why I think in previous interviews, and part of the advocacy that I do is for the credibility and the validity of the science that we are using. And that requires deep knowledge and deep dedication to the research and to the translation of it. And I think it's very easy to see who those people are who have picked up, the Neuroscience for Dummies book and then just tries to translate. And by the way, Neuroscience for Dummies is actually a great book. But,
the Dummies books are really good.
Yes. But to your point, there absolutely is a danger in someone using these terms to make it seem as if they know something. But then can they actually put it into practical application and practice, which is where most people fail.
What part does learning theory play in all this as well? Because neuroscience is fairly recent science, or at least it's taken leaps and bounds, as I say, in the last couple of decades, having been a bit quiet in the years before that. If we go previous to the 21st century, experimental psychology might seem to be more important, and cognitivists and behaviorists and so on. So we have this kind of wealth of learning theory, 2,500 years, in fact, since the Greeks, as we cover in my sister podcast, I have to say, Great Minds of Learning, and that is kind of there, and learning people feel they have to kind of know a bit about that, and then along comes neuroscience. Now, it's a more recent development. Are there conflicts there? Do the two things sit comfortably together in your view, or do they sometimes fight? I mean, will kind of insights from cognitivists conflict with what neuroscience tells us, for instance?
They definitely do fight on the outside, but I see, and I've experienced, and I've learned myself as a scientific learning designer, which is how do we harmonize the two? Because as you pointed out, the psychology has been around for a greater amount of time than the neuroscience has, and because of that, I think we have sort of created our own cognitive biases of what is right and what is wrong. But even when you look at cognitive learning theory is all about the way that people think, and at the basic level, that theory suggests that our internal thoughts and external forces are both important. But what actually is cognition for the brain? And how do we work within that and the underlying mechanisms of cognition to enhance the way that we learn? We can look at behavioral learning theory as well, again, based in psychology. But now that we've got neuroscience, we understand what are some of the underlying neuromechanisms, the neurochemistries that actually create behavior and stimulate motivation, and how do we activate it and use those? So I feel that there is a great opportunity to harmonize the two, because one influences the other.
Is it at all useful can you draw a distinction between what's biological and what's cultural when you look at these things? So obviously from a neuroscience type of lens, certain things are their biology, they're kind of chemicals, their structure of the brain and so on. A psychologist comes to this with something which is cultural, the way that we're kind of the 50% of us that comes about through the way that we're reared and educated, rather than there's that kind of 50-50 heuristic. Is that a useful distinction in kind of harmonizing the two things, the two fields?
I think it has a definite element. I think all of it is part of the whole ecosystem of not only how we are as an individual human being, but then it obviously influences the way that we learn. And when we look at the work of Carol Dweck, the growth versus fixed mindset, we saw how environment and culture played a very intricate role in someone's developmental processes. But I think what the general public, and especially people in learning development, sort of had a hard time wrapping their heads around is because they haven't been exposed to the fact that there are very intrinsic underlying things that are happening in our system, in our brains, in our bodies, that are supporting everything that is externalized. And I think it's because of the fact that they have been exposed for such a great amount of time to learning theory and from the side of psychology, that getting neuroscience and wrapping your head around, no pun intended, the fact that everything that we do from breathing, thinking, walking, eating, smelling, touching, all of it is because of something that is happening in our brains that's producing it.
Okay, so the neuroscience is fundamental, underlying, whereas the cultural stuff is perhaps slightly more. Does that mean it's more changeable? Is the neuroscience kind of like, look, you're not going to change this. This is just the way the brain is because it's chemistry and it's biology. Whereas the cultural stuff, maybe we can kind of unlearn some of that stuff. Is neuroscience really fixed?
No, not at all. I mean, the beauty about our brains is the plasticity of them and our abilities to continually change and develop and manipulate, and even destruction within our brains when it comes to as we get older, we know that we actually degenerate. There's going to be parts of our brains that are starting to degenerate a little bit, and I think there's other parts that elevate at times. A very clear understanding of how plasticity works, I think, is when we look at stroke patients and we see miraculous recoveries when one part of the brain is able to restructure itself and rewire and re-network in order to support the function that was lost. And we see this in case studies all across neuroscience. And once you understand the extreme abilities within, the things that we can't see, we can't just look into our own brains and see networks forming, and we can't see the electricity and we can't see the chemistry happening, but it is happening. And because of that, it is that malleability that allows us to change. But it does take time and it does take effort.
Having talked about your serious field of study, I don't want to sort of come back to the piracy, which we've dealt with in a light-hearted way. But I wonder if there's a serious side to that. You've had a bit of fun with that as a hook, and it's part of your brand. But are there serious points in there? Have you studied the history of piracy? I say this because, I've come across theorists of the internet and so on. I think, about 5-6 years ago, there was a book that came out called Be More Pirate, which was for entrepreneurs, and it sort of drew on the history of piracy. And more recently, we've seen in decolonizing history, people have taken a different view of pirate communities in Madagascar and so on, which was sort of kind of outside the imperial powers and the East India Company and so on, and perhaps the only place you could go if you were outside of that culture. Sorry, long-winded question. Is there a serious side to the piracy thing?
I think there is. I think we often think of pirates as the movie versions, right? The Captain Jack Sparrows and, drunk, a little bit brutish and entertaining. But when you look at the history of pirates, and, most of them were just ordinary people who had been forced to turn to criminal activity to make ends meet. When you look at the history of how these happened, and I love them, that there are some historians who describe sort of pirate ships as the original republics, right? Like the captains had to be elected. And all the decisions were really based upon what benefited the crew, what benefited the greater good. And it's interesting because when you look at back in the day, what were they actually stealing? Yes, they were going after the golds and the gems and whatnot. But the thing that was really most valuable to them were necessities of life, flour, medicine. Those were really the treasures that they were after. What I find amazing when it comes to when I looked into the history of pirates, I was really interested to know who were the female pirates and what role did they play. And there were some absolute, if I can say, but pretty kick-ass female pirates.
Pirate queens, yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce this right, but it's Chang Yi Sao was one of the greatest, most successful pirates, and she ran like this massive fleet after her husband passed, and she dominated the seas for quite some time until I believe the story goes that I think everybody was after her, but I think it was finally the British who got her. And she said, well, I'll just give it all up if you just let me keep what I've got. I'll stop doing this. And she went on, she went to run a gambling house, until she died. So that was pretty impressive. Grace O'Malley, she had 20 ship fleet that stood up against the British monarchies. It was, these powerful women leaders back in the day as well, which I thought was pretty cool.
Yeah. So there's perhaps a better gender balance and clearly no glass ceiling. What other lessons can L&D take from the history of piracy? I should say that I've got an even more, Pirates of the Caribbean is most people's cultural reference. Being old, I've got another one, which is, there was a BBC TV program called Captain Pugwash, which is sort of an animated cartoon. I mean, it isn't really an animated cartoon. It was incredibly primitive. It was bits of paper being moved around, and someone would kind of pull a stick for the jaw to move and things like that. And it had a very jaunty tune. But old people will remember that, but young people would just be going, what? What should L&D people take from the history of piracy?
What I would like to see more do is to voice the opinions of what is needed and then take action. One thing about pirates is that they didn't sit around and have, days long meetings about what to do. They had an agenda and they executed that agenda. And I think this is something that we, as a profession, as an industry right now, I think this is something that we definitely need to embody, which is there are several conversations happening all around the world in learning and development about what's not happening and how we're not doing things as best as we can. And as a result of that, this past couple of years, and especially this last year in North America, I can speak to my colleagues in Australia have reported back. I believe it's starting now to happen in the UK as well, is we're seeing entire teams be made redundant. They're being let go. And the only way that we're going to stop that bleed is to start to more strongly voice and prove and demonstrate the values that we bring as people who support learning, a fundamental practice in any organization and just in life in general. We need to start voicing it, but we also have to start taking different actions, because the actions that we have taken for the last 50 years, we're still in that. We might have added some technology, and technology might have given us some advancements, but we're fundamentally doing things the same way, and it's got to change.
The Learning Hack podcast is supported by Learning News, the learning sector's newswire. Rob and his team are good friends of the podcast, and we really value the help and advice we've had from them, and they do a great job. For the very latest news from around the learning sector, for interviews with learning leaders, the latest from learning sector vendors and features on workplace learning, go to learningnews.com. Tell us about your latest venture in bringing this about, supporting L&D in doing that, which is joining forces with your brain.
My masterpiece, or my symphony, as I like to call it. Joining forces with your brain is an interactive, scientifically designed learning series. I don't like to call it a course. I think course is a dirty word. This is a journey that I am taking people on to help them to understand at that fundamental level, like we were speaking about, how does my brain work? How does that operate? And then how do I learn better with all of the strategies and practices and ways, whether it be, I think we're starting to dive into learning theory once we start filming again. But it's really was my way, not only just for the learning and development industry, but for our global population, to start understanding a little bit more about how do we operate, what is your brain capable of doing, and how do you join forces with it? Because I think what I learned very early on in my studies was there were so many ways that I was working against my own brain. I was working against the operational system. And when you learn how to join forces with it, whether that be to understand how do I create a stronger memory for transfer, or what does it really mean to change my behavior in a strategic and intentional way and work with that underlying chemistry in my brain that's going to help me do that. Or, I could go on, focus and attention, like I mentioned earlier. Focus is a skill, and focus is a skill that we can get better at. But it also does require you to know, well, what is attention? Because attention is not the same as focus. Attention is the mechanism to focus. So the series was created not only to educate, but to insert practices within it. So you are developing the skill of focus and attention. You're developing the skill of memory, and you're understanding how to harmonize this with your everyday work and your everyday world.
It's fascinating. I'm getting really interested in this because I had terrible problems with attention. I map out the day and say, well, I'm going to do this edit in this half-day period. And then I find I don't want to do that. I want to listen to this podcast. I want to play computer patience for half an hour, the radio, whatever. And then 5 o'clock in the morning, I suddenly thought, oh yes, now I want to do that edit. That's peculiar, isn't it? I mean, do I have a condition, or is this just a manifestation of how we are not joining forces with our brains? You think the general thing?
I think a lot of people are experiencing the same thing. As beautiful and wonderful as technology helps us, it's also hurting us, and that needs to be addressed. We've seen, behaviors have changed. The brain hasn't changed itself. It's our behaviors towards what we're doing which have changed. And we can certainly join forces with that, and we can certainly harness that. But there needs to be an awareness of that's even happening in the moment. In joining forces in the series, we talk about metacognition. We don't just talk about metacognition and your ability to, sort of get a handle on your cognitive processes. But when we look at the metacognitive theory, it's being able to be aware of what you're doing, what you're thinking, how you're feeling in the moment, and being able to shift faster so that if you do realize, wait a second, I've been on YouTube looking at cat videos for now, it's been 30 minutes. Well, how do we take that down to 10 minutes? How do we take that 10 minutes down to 5 minutes? But if you don't have an awareness of that, if we're not able to activate that, which most people, they can't, because it does take a lot of cognitive energy, but it also takes a lot of us training us, then we are missing those opportunities. So I think, I'm going to circle back and sort of wrap this up when it comes to learning and development, is we often want and we often are looking for some type of a behavioral change in learning designs that we do. We'll take it into an organization. They want to see some type of behavioral change or skill or ability. But what the biggest fail that I see is that you want a behavior change, but you're neglecting the fact that most people don't even have the abilities to understand how to change a behavior to begin with. So you're putting the cart before the horse. If we empower people with the understanding of, well, what is behavior and what is motivation? And how am I going to get in my own way? And how can I activate certain parts of not only my neurochemistry, but my strategy in order to make this process much more easier for me to do something that I want to do or accomplish, or that my business needs me to do or accomplish. But we very often, John, I see the cart is being put before the horse. So we're asking people to do something, but we're not giving the underlying skills first for them to be able to be successful in it.
On that subject of attention, are our attention spans vanishing due to technology? Is it true that we now have shorter attention spans than goldfish?
I'd have to look at the exact research, but from what I saw, especially over the pandemic, it was the behaviors. It was more behavioral than the attention itself. And I think, again, when you look at the method, or excuse me, not the method, but the understanding that if attention is the mechanism to focus, you need attention to focus. And there are multiple attentional networks in the brain. But if attention is the mechanism to focus, and this is in joining forces, if you stop at any point of your day and you ask yourself a very simple question, which is, where is my attention? And if my attention is being split between the music playing in the background, multiple tabs open on my laptop, my cell phone, and my chats there, well, I've got my attention divided, which means my focus is not in one place, it's in multiple places.
Hmm. So it's not the technology; it's a behavioural thing. That's kind of a trick question about the goldfish, because I tried to track down that research and couldn't find it at all. Which brings us on to myth busting. I know you've done a certain amount of fighting learning disinformation. I've seen you engage in trying to root out those myths on social media. It's whack-a-mole, especially when it comes to things like learning styles. Do you think that these are battles that can be won, or does it just exhaust you trying to put them right?
Both. It's incredibly exhausting. But there is a responsibility for us as scientists to keep up that fight. There's too many people. I think, we spoke a little bit earlier about those sort of just dropping terminology, the synapses or the myelin sheath or neuroplasticity, and then, claim to be proficient in neuroscience and learning. And then there's people like me who will look at it and go, wait a second, where did you get this off of a fortune cookie, or was it in like a bubble gum wrapper? Where did you get all this information from? It's incredibly exhausting because there is so much misinformation out there, where I think that anyone who's listening can help in that battle is to do their due diligence. Who is the source? And do a little bit of digging. Popularity does not mean accuracy. So do a little bit more digging.
And the source isn't always that bad. I've come across examples of completely erroneous stuff that had the badge of a top 5 consultancy on it. I've got to name names, but one of them begins with D. And there was a piece that Microsoft picked up, particularly about kind of attention spans and so on. They don't always come from scurrilous places, and kind of noble institutions within the professional area of learning have been known to kind of echo false information, like kind of learning styles and so on as well. Yeah. So one does have to be very careful.
Well, I mean, I've been incredibly public with my takedowns of those larger institutions. 2 years ago, it was LinkedIn Learning for spreading false information through some of their courses. Most recently was Chief Learning Officer, one of the largest learning publications in North America. And what I've discovered is that they're not validating their content and their content providers. And they have nobody on their side of things who could even come close to understanding if it was right or wrong. So they're really, again, the people who I see being published when it comes to the sciences are those, like you said, John, who have held public positions and who have made a good reputation for themselves. But when you start digging into the efficacy of their science, which I've done, it's completely inaccurate. And they are not helping this battle at all, which is why, I think I said in a previous interview, I'm very happy to burn the bridges that I didn't want to stand on in the first place.
It's the pirate.
Yar.
Yar. So which came first, piracy or an interest in learning? How did you get into doing what you're doing? How did you first get into the world of learning, and then how did you pursue that to where you are at the moment?
Well, as a human, I think the piracy came first. I was up to no good from a very young age. So I was such a little adventurous devil. But when it came to the learning, I've always, I think even from a young age, I think I've always been an educator. I've always been a teacher. And it just evolved throughout my career. And, I found myself at a young age as an English teacher in Japan, moved there when I was 19, and just fell in love with teaching in itself. And through that experience, I spent several years living in Japan teaching. And through those years, I sort of just kind of continued up the hierarchy. And I said, hey, how would you like to teach some of the people from BMW Japan and Tokyo Disneyland and JAL? I said, that'd be wonderful. Let's try that. And so I got exposed to the corporate world of learning. But then when neuroscience came to me many years later, this was just as I was a CLO as one of the largest tech companies. it was game over, because I had to sort of wave my white flag at that point and say, oh my God, I have been educating and teaching and designing and training and facilitating for years now. And not once had I ever thought about the thing doing all of it. And so neuroscience just dominated me after that. And it was my own curiosity that I kept chasing. It was my own experiences going through a very challenging learning endeavor when I started studying the brain itself, and understanding as an adult how difficult that could be. That reframed my entire experience and then my entire professional career moving forward.
So it's interesting in your response there that you started off with language learning. From a theory point of view, language learning, when I was sort of looking at Duolingo recently, I kind of dipped a toe in this and found that there's a whole load of learning theory, particularly related to language learning, that I knew nothing about. And they seem to have different sources and gurus and so on. Could you, I mean, is that the case? I mean, presumably the neuroscience is equally applicable across those areas, but what's the learning theory like on language learning?
It's very interesting when you look at it through the lens of the brain, because we develop our language abilities in our native tongues between ages of 0 and 5. And the best time to learn second, third languages is sort of within that critical period, because essentially with our networks, when they become so strong, once we've got that sort of that language encoded, now what we're doing as an adult, or even, for those of us who studied in high school, I had to take French. As a Canadian, we're taught French from a young age, and then in university we have to do a secondary language as well. But it's incredibly challenging because you're trying to build new networks to represent this new language, but they exist within the same space as your native tongue. So it's very challenging to compete with those networks and to build new ones. I learned Japanese. I'm not fluent in it anymore, but I learned Japanese when I moved to Japan. I've tried to pick up little bits of languages as I've gone through my travels, but it is a very different sort of part. First of all, it's very specific parts of the brain, but when you understand how challenging it is because of how strong those networks are, as we develop our native tongues, you understand why it's so difficult to pick up a new language as we get older.
It is probably the first thing we learn, isn't it? Language. Apart from, don't put your hand in the fire and whatever.
Yes.
Adventurousness always being a spur to learning, I've found. So language, there's a kind of primacy to language. So it really is quite a specialized area, language learning.
And I think it's something that, I think about going back and revisiting my studies in Japanese, and I think I could pick it up relatively faster now that I've got at least some foundation still in there. But then I look at the other skills that I would have learned when I was younger. And, I was a classically trained pianist, and I haven't sat down at the piano for forever. I'm like, how could I use what I know now and design my learning experience to teach myself piano in a whole new way with the science. And I love to challenge myself like that. I taught myself how to juggle using science just for fun. I just wanted to see if I applied everything that I knew, would I achieve the results that I was looking for in a more efficient manner? And I did.
Yeah, and I think Carl Chrysostomo had who you...
Correct. We did that together as well. Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting that as a musician, it's interesting to hear about for me to hear about the piano, that you kind of had two cracks at it, early and late. You come across this concept called muscle memory with learning music. When my band got back together after kind of 10 years apart, 20 years apart, we had to kind of stand in a room and look at each other and work out how we'd played the songs all that time ago. And what we kept talking about was muscle memory. Oh yes, when we get to this bit, suddenly my hands know what to do. Is that a fallacy, or?
I haven't done much research on this, although I want to say that I did come across, and I'm not going to remember who it was. I can see her face. I just don't remember her name. A scientist who said that muscle memory wasn't actually a thing. So I'd have to validate that. But I mean, memory trace, yes, definitely a thing.
Yeah, very interesting. So we have to close out now, unfortunately. Could talk all afternoon, or morning in your case. Lastly, in the world of learning, who and what are the sources that you turn to personally for knowledge and inspiration? What are your water holes, if you like?
I mean, all of the scientists whose research I can possibly get my hands on, from, one of Barbara Oakley, a engineer and neuroscientist. She was part of my inspiration for joining forces with your brain. Mark A. McDaniel, one of the authors of Make It Stick, who told me in a in-person conversation he said, "Lauren, can you tell everyone to stop bastardizing our work?" And I said, "Okay, I can do that." And go out and do that. So I greatly admire and follow them. The community leaders in our industry, those who are really bringing people to learn and to share knowledge. So I'll give a shout out to the L&D Shakers and to the Offbeat community and to the GLDC and the Learning Network and all of these gorgeous communities globally. To our new leaders as well. Dr. Keith Keating, Helen Marshall, Kathy Hoy, those who are trying to reframe leadership and what it means to be a CLO. And I would definitely be remiss if I didn't mention every single one of my board members who helped me to continually learn and be a better scientist and designer. You can, Dr. Celine Mullins, Dr. Nick Hobson, Dr. Chris Lee, Elliot Jarding, they're all up there. And podcast hosts like you, John, of course. Yeah. I mean, the podcast hosts who give us the reach and the platform and the audience, and then get to spread that knowledge. I learn from everyone. Well,
it's a joy to talk to those people, and it's been a real joy to talk to you today. Thank you very much, Lauren.
Thank you. Likewise.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Many thanks to our guest and to our sponsors. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship. If you want to help others find us, please like, follow, rate, review, and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube.
Next time, we look at the Nordics. I'll be talking to the CEO of Valamis, Jussi Hurskainen, who has built a global learning systems business from his base in Finland. Until then,
stay curious, learning people.